Those who are banking on the scenario that the human race will never find out its actual origin and history devise all kinds of clever methods to dissuade us from inquiring into this real history. A routinely used technique in their attempts to discredit the alternative history researchers is telling the people, don't even listen to those amateurs. They have no proper education, they are not experts, they don't know enough historic facts to make conclusions. Listen to the real professional experts instead. In this short documentary, I want to show you what kind of extremely dodgy stuff is being presented to us as some sort of scientific research by the so-called experts that they are trying to foist under the disguise of expert scientists. This time the examples will be taken from the official history of the Inca Empire and the Caral Supe civilization. The experts assure us that the Incas acquired all these vast territories and expanded their mighty empire within a just shorty 90 years. 90 years of continuous war, non-stop very bloody battles. Wars have devastating effects on the economies of the countries involved. For example, Germany during the Second World War, which was, by the way, much shorter than 90 years, had to simply stop at some point all residential construction of homes simply because the population was too exhausted by the war. They had no strength to build anything, no finances, no resources, no materials. But this doesn't shake the confidence of the experts, and they continue to claim that against all odds, the Incas fought on many fronts, simultaneously winning new territories and at the same time managing to keep the already conquered ones under control. Further, the experts continue that these amazing Incas in those very 90 short years constructed a very good amount of monumental architecture, megaliths of gigantic proportions, and precision that rivals our 3D printing technology. Although those very same experts claim that the Incas were rather primitive and did not have any hard tools for working with the hard varieties of stone, still they continue to maintain that somehow or other they built all these megaliths. And on the top of all this, during those very same 90 years, they constructed an extensive network of roads at places some 7 meters wide. They cross the Andes, the South American Cordillera Mountains, and reaching all the way to Santiago, nowadays Chile. The longest well-preserved segment of such a road is some 6,000 kilometers long. The total length of Inca roads is roughly estimated to be some 15 to 30,000 kilometers in length. A construction project of this magnitude would put a strain even on our modern budgets, especially taking into consideration the harsh mountain terrain. For example, the technology of nowadays Peru supposedly far surpasses that of the Incas. At least now we have modern vehicles with wheels, we have steel and iron tools of transportation and building, and on the top of that the population is many times more, supposedly according to the experts, than in the times of the Inca Empire. And still the Peruvians nowadays cannot get themselves together to build a road system that covers all of their cities. Till date, many of their cities are not accessible by road and only by air. When I lived in Peru, I was in the city of Pucallpa. It's a big city, and it is still part-time connected to the capital Lima by road. By part-time, I mean it depends on the season. When it starts raining, they simply have to close the road. It is so poorly constructed that it doesn't function when it rains. The picture of the Inca Empire, painted by the so-called experts, seems to be radically divorced from reality. And still they continue to insist that in these 90 years, half of the male population was fighting, the other half was building, and they fail to mention even who was feeding all this, who was supplying the resources for the army and all that. Don't forget that allegedly agriculture was much more laborious and difficult in those times than it is nowadays. Even most basic common sense is not required to become an expert. For example, those experts tell us that the stones for constructing the megaliths at Ollantaytambo were quarried in a relatively nearby quarry of pink granite. That also includes, along with the pinkish colored granite, the gray colored one, which is also seen at the site. It is seen in the megalithic construction, but it is not seen in its so-called quarry. Well, yet another miracle. Barely anything can surprise me anymore, especially looking at the confidence with which the experts assure us that the Incas built Ollantaytambo, although in the very same chronicles that they are taking us Holy Bible, Holy Truth that cannot be questioned, in those very same chronicles there is a vivid description of how an Inca ruler tried to get together his people to transport only one of these megalithic stones, not even a big one, uphill. The full enterprise ended in disaster. The stone rolled downhill, smashing many people on its way. The reason for which they can get away with publishing such a weird stuff in the disguise of science is that they say, well, listen, we are not making all this up. We are simply trying our best to make the best sense possible of the authentic chronicles that were written by the first colonialists. Are they really trying? If they were really trying that, then how come all the originals of these writings are locked up in archives and neither the common people nor the actual historians have any access to them? Some are not available at all. Most are available in corrected editions. But what was the need of correcting them? Why are the originals hidden? There is no lack of digital imaging technology nowadays. It would be very easy to make public digital copies of the precious original chronicles, and why their accuracy has never been questioned. For example, those very chronicles, or at least the editions that are available to us, tell us the story of how the colonialists dismantled the fort of Sacsayhuaman and built the cathedral in the nearby town with the stone from Sacsayhuaman. Strange enough, Sacsayhuaman is still standing and the cathedral is built of a different variety of stone.
В принципе, если предположить, что это был узкий скальный коридор, где можно было бочком-бочком протиснуться на вершину. Вот. А потом кусок скалы отвалился. Логичная версия, да? Если это лестница, а здесь на потолке что? Совершенно не вяжется. Во всяком случае, в нашу логику не укладывается.
And it is even more confusing. How come these experts, they study for so many years, and at the end they don't notice things that even people without specialized education clearly see? Like, for example, the fact that many of the megalithic sites appear to be destroyed by something that leaves behind an aftermath very similar to that of a huge explosion. The best example are the ruins of Pumapunku and the so-called lake at Sacsayhuaman. Very large blocks are scattered around in a fashion that could not have been a result of earthquake. Earthquakes don't send stones flying 30-40 meters sideways on a even terrain, and even more so when they are scattered around in a circle. Some of the megalithic towers of Peru have also suffered a suspicious way of destruction. It is often observed that their stones are scattered around in the fields and don't lay just beside them where they would have been if the towers were destroyed by earthquake, for example. To suggest that some sort of primitive enemy of whoever the builders were destroyed the towers and then started carrying the megalithic stones around in the fields also doesn't make any sense at all. But what about Caral Supe? Here we don't have contradictory medieval chronicles to confuse the poor experts, and still we get a very weird story again. First, a town-like settlement with pyramidal structures was found some 200 kilometers away from Lima. Later on, 17 more such towns were excavated in the valley of Supe. That's why the civilization is called Caral Supe, and it is considered that altogether they functioned like a state, in other words, like a country. Now, the official history of the development of human society in South America was that some 10,000 years ago, people gradually started making ceramic vessels, and then they gradually evolved. Again, this is mainstream history, into forming primitive societies and eventually states and even empire, the Inca Empire. And at the same time, they are telling us that the civilization of Caral Supe existed 5,000 years ago and it didn't have any pottery at all. And indeed, no pieces of pottery have been found anywhere in these 18 settlement towns. So what is this, some sort of an exception? How can it be the exception if this is the only civilization of this type that they're placing in this time period? And how on earth do they dare to suggest that absolutely primitive people without just eating wild fruits without any culture or any organization at all in society, all of a sudden organize a state, start building pyramids, and by the way, have a full range of all types of domesticated plants, all of the ones that are even nowadays cultivated in the region. The full set of such plants have been found at Caral Supe. To suggest that all this appeared in a second out of nowhere, where is the gradual and slow evolution that they're preaching all the time? That sounds as believable as the unbelievable stories that they are telling us about the Michigan copper mining as seen in the previous episodes. Both are equally ridiculous. But let's get back to Caral. I think what actually happened is when they saw the pyramids and how similar they are to all the other pyramids in the world, that they simply decided to throw it as much as possible back in time, amazing 5,000 years, only to make it more confusing for people who try to make the connections between all these cultures that were building very similar things all over the world. In reality, the experts have absolutely no clue how to date Caral and have no intention or desire to do so. Their main task is to maintain this facade mirage that the past is under control, the main things are figured out for sure, only small details are missing, and they will be surely filled up in future with future research. Don't you worry about that. Don't ask questions about the past. And most importantly, don't try to research it yourself. That is why it is so extremely difficult to get permission to dig at the important and interesting archaeological sites. Indeed, at the most interesting ones, it is absolutely prohibited. You can't even apply. For the others, you can apply and you get refused. But for example, for Giza, they don't even accept applications. Because the more sites and artifacts get unveiled, the clearer it becomes that the official history doesn't fit the reality. Very well preserved examples of using quipu have been found in Caral. Well, but since the residents of the Caral Supe towns disappeared after existing for short couple of 100 years, that's what the experts assure us, and although they disappeared, quipu re-emerged in the very same form after 4,000 years with the Incas. Well, I personally don't believe it. I think that there was a definite connection between these cultures. I don't believe that this very peculiar way of storing information can be just rediscovered in the very same region after 4,000 years by chance. So what about building pyramids? The Caral civilization disappeared, according to the experts, 4,000 years ago. And this is the Tucumán pyramid in Peru, supposedly much more recent. So the pyramids were also rediscovered by chance after 4,000 years? Although it has seen better times, and this is most definitely a pyramid made of raw mud bricks. And this is how somewhat better preserved structures in the area look like. And yet another gigantic pyramid made of raw mud bricks in the same area, but the experts are not extremely interested in advertising or studying it. They quickly mention it as a tomb without any details, and then direct our attention to an old tree and tell us that this is the main attraction of the area. And only if one is very lucky, one will find information like this, that in the Laraya mountain there are cities of pyramids, some 250 of them, again made of these raw mud bricks. So the conclusion is, if we really want to know our history, we have to start from scratch. It won't help adding lost ancient civilizations to the current history. Like, for example, it has become a fashion lately to attribute almost anything to a lost ancient civilization which was wiped out by a natural disaster 12,000 years ago. How can that be true if most of the information on which this suggestion is based is again mainstream? The samurais were the military elite of medieval and early modern Japan. But how did they really look like? Maybe something like this. When modern Asian actors play the roles of samurais, they will look like this. However, I would like to introduce to you Okubo Toshimiti, who was a hereditary samurai from Satsuma. So this video will be about what kind of distortions of the history could have led to such a terrible misunderstanding. And that's why we'll try to go as far as possible back in the Japanese history, before the Asian race populated the islands.
Back then, they were completely different creatures. And completely different people. Long before the arrival of the Asian race on the Japanese islands, the local inhabitants were Caucasian people, the Aino people. As of today, the Aino people are almost completely blended with the Asian race and have lost almost completely their ethnic identity. But there are still some clues of their traditional philosophy and their view of life, and those point towards a clear connection with the culture which we call the culture of the survivors, a worldwide civilization or a group of people which sent its representatives worldwide to blend in with the simple local people. And that's why the views of the Ainos, philosophy, cosmology, dharma, and everything else, is exactly like that of other native people who live many thousands of kilometers away. The fact that the original inhabitants of the island were Caucasian is not denied in Japan, as they try to do in China and Siberia, where they killed them all a long time ago. And when Caucasian mummies of very tall people are being dug up, they pretend as if nothing happened and they don't change the history of the regions. So in Japan, somehow the Ainos survived. But still, not enough research is done to determine their real place in history, because that will trigger the revelations about how and why the population of such a vast area, which includes Siberia, Central Asia, China, and so on, so that the purpose of erasing the memory about the culture of the survivors, the official historians are not encouraged to delve much into the real history of the indigenous people. Instead, they always give very superficial information about the latest inhabitants, the current inhabitants, and they tried to create the impression that they were the only inhabitants ever there. And in terms of the concepts of various waves of survivors, a concept that we reviewed in the episode about America, it seems that the Aino belong towards the earlier waves that we know of. Now, let's see a bit more about the last wave.
This is a Portuguese world map dated at the year 1623, and the maker considered Japan to be a Christian country. That is why he placed this big cross over the Japanese islands. And this map maker was not the only one. The island, which is nowadays called Hokkaido, had a different name in the Middle Ages, and the name was Jesu, which sounds like Jesus, the Slavic name of Jesus Christ. And to make it even more clear, they have put a Christian cross on it. This is yet another map showing the same island, and here it is written as Jesu, which sounds even closer to Jesus, the Slavic name of Jesus Christ. So what's the problem of having Christianity in Japan in the past? Why is it removed from the mainstream history? The reason for removing all traces of Christianity in Japan was to erase the memory of the people who brought it there. As we are gonna see in the future episodes, these were men, the last who remained alive from the defeated army of the last nation, which refused to accept the rule of the parasitic forces, which kept the records of the real history of the human races, and which, as we're gonna see in the next episode about China, still had some of the abilities that now we call supernatural. Of course, for them they were natural. And they had those abilities because of the connection with Hyperborea, which probably was one of the cultures or civilizations which served as a basis for the legend of what we call now collectively Atlantis. Of course, the official Japanese history has undergone parasitic corrections, but still, few forgotten facts here and there may help us reconstruct the real scenario. Exactly when in Russia the last strongholds of the survivors were destroyed, at that time in Japan appears a ruler called Tokugawa Ieyasu. It is possible that his name points towards the fact that he was a Christian, Jesus. When Tokugawa Ieyasu starts ruling, Japan all of a sudden decides to sever all connections with the external world and remain a completely closed country. Most likely the defeated survivors from Siberia sought refuge in a faraway, relatively isolated land on an island, a land in the east, where the influence of the survivors' culture was always stronger. And that's why the Ainu were not completely exterminated over there back then, as was the case in Siberia and Central Asia. Even according to the official history of Japan at that time, the country was greatly influenced by the so-called Rusui, which sounds very similar to Rusi, which not so long time ago in the Slavic languages was used to point towards the people of what we call Russia nowadays. Even in the Latin languages, the connection is still clear, Russi, Russians. And as we're gonna see in the future episodes, these Russi were running, fleeing their own land, because what we call nowadays Russia is not as old as they want us to think, and it was artificially created, so to say, to replace another country, the biggest on earth, and yet a country that you will not find even a single sentence about in your standard history.
In the official history of Japan, they conveniently simply don't mention where the Russians came from. The center of the Rusoi was Edo, and we see some buildings there that really don't fit in the Japanese style of architecture. Traditionally, the Asian population of Japan used to construct their buildings out of wood, not stone. The choice of material is not the most important. Most importantly, we see how in the history of building in Japan, all of a sudden, without any prior evolution, we see full-fledged, elegant, megalithic stone masonry, which is a distinct signature of the survivors. That is how they built their buildings all over the world. This is St. Petersburg in Russia.
This is Saxo-Herman, Peru. This is Norba, Italy.
Polygonal megalithic building masonry is a very peculiar building style, where each stone is uniquely shaped, and yet fits all the neighboring stones with amazing accuracy. The chance that this style is evolved independently in various locations all around the world is very close to zero.
Again, the faces on these portraits are not exactly what we call Japanese. This is how contemporary artists depicted the kings of Japan, the shoguns. They were the rulers of the samurais and continued their reign until the middle of 19th century when the colonial military forces destroyed the last strongholds of the old culture. And their outfits as well are clearly Mughal style. So this is funny, it says comedy in Japan, and then we have these people with clearly European faces and outfits performing something. Since the actual mission of the European Reformation was to obliterate, kill, destroy anybody or anything who had any connection or knowledge of this culture of the survivors, or the wisdom left by the previous advanced civilizations on Earth in any form. That's why they didn't hesitate to go to such a faraway place and establish a new order of things in a country which didn't need them at all and basically lived peacefully and self-sufficiently. The wipeout of the samurais is presented in the Scarigir version of history as the Meiji Restoration, and that is supposed to be a return towards some previously forgotten ideologies, values, and political structures. Very little information, very little importance is given to this moment in history when they teach it in the Japanese schools. They go through it very briefly and superficially. And it is presented to be some sort of local for Japan event. And maybe there will be some very vague hint towards the European ships that appeared on the shore of Japan at that time. Indeed, in some Japanese textbooks, they are presented as merchants' ships that were helping by giving donations of rice. Rice sounds so innocent, but there were other things besides the rice. But fortunately, there are always people who are brave enough to stand for the truth, and that's why we have a book which tells a completely different story about these foreign ships off the shore of Japan. A story which matches the historic photographs and artifacts much better. Black Ships of Japan. Quite an ambiguous title by itself. So what we read there is that Commodore Perry arrived in Edo in 1853 and brought a letter from Fillmore, the President of the United States, demanding in absolutely straightforward language to put an end to the isolation of Japan and open it to the rest of the world in every way. Perry returned next year and demanded this to be done immediately. The people of Japan did not wish to step back from their way of life, from their tradition and ideology. However, the story continues, they changed their mind after they encountered the English military force. Well, as a result of this military encounter, the samurais were defeated and the Japanese society was forced to accept the Western way of life and to reform their traditional views. So this is the true meaning of the Meiji Restoration. Threaten Japan by military force and making it a part of the cobweb of the parasitic rule which engulfed the earth at that point almost completely. So in the modern Japanese textbooks, as we said, it is called a return to old values, this Meiji Restoration. What do they mean old? Do they mean like the times of Atlantis, when a very similar thing happened? People used to live in harmony with nature, and then the parasitic influence infected everything and made it rot completely. In the set material of Jane Roberts, this set personality clearly warns us that we may do the same, that we may follow the sad example of Atlantis. The last group of samurais was killed in 1868 in town of Aizu Wakamatsu in northern Japan. Nowadays, in the castle of Aizu Wakamatsu, there is a museum. In this museum, there is a huge piece of art depicting the very last moments of the samurais. And of course, they are shown as belonging to the Asian race, because this is just a modern piece of art. So the attention of the visitors is attracted to the big modern statues, and not many of them notice a small photograph which is found in one of the minor shrines of the complex. This gentleman was also a real samurai, not some actor playing as samurai. He took part in some of the last samurai battles when he was young, and as you can see, again, European features.
If you visit the valley of Aizu even nowadays, you will meet on the street a lot of local people with purely European faces, but of course most of them would be a mixture between Asians and Caucasians. As I was researching this topic, I found Japanese people posting on forums questions why I look European, why I'm Caucasian, I'm Japanese, and yet I do not look like Japanese. I noticed the questions, I didn't see any answers in the forums. We also see the crescent symbol on the head of the samurais, which was one of the main symbols of the empire and the culture of the survivors. And this is an authentic, genuine samurai outfit.
So in this museum, in the Tsurugacho Castle in Aizu Wakamatsu, as I mentioned earlier, there is this huge piece of art, maybe like a real life-size statues of the last moments of the samurais as they commit seppuku, ceremonial suicide, when the enemies are about to enter the room in which they are. So, okay, the samurais themselves are depicted as Asians, but even on this piece of art, surprise, surprise, who is standing at the threshold? Who is the enemy which is about to enter the room, and that's why they commit suicide? It is a person with clearly Caucasian features, dressed in some sort of military uniform, maybe something like Napoleon's uniform, something of that sort. So Anatoly Fomenko, on whose research the most interesting stuff in this episode is based, he describes his visit to this museum. So he was accompanied by colleagues, Japanese historians, and when they reached this scene, he pointed at this European person who was causing the suicide of the samurais and asked them, who is he? At this point, the Japanese historians they pretended that they don't understand well the speech of foreigners and couldn't answer for this reason, although even a beginner in English will very well understand the question, who is he?
The true face of the so-called local Meiji restoration in Japan, the very truth is that some of the last survivors were most brutally and barbarically killed by Europeans. These Europeans had the blood of the survivors also flowing in their veins, but they were zombified by the fraudulent parasitic propaganda that packages cruelty, inhumane cruelty, in calling it patriotism and other names that have nothing to do with the essence.
There is nothing patriotic about going halfway across the globe to murder peaceful population, which is completely unknown to you and leads a noble life in harmony with nature. So how come the historic quarters of the most important Japanese towns look exactly like European cities? Of course, the official sources will assure you that it was built all after Japan accepted the Western influence, but that doesn't make much sense for many reasons. First of all, by the time the actual influence was felt in the real life in Japan, the Western influence, the neoclassical style, and that's the official name of this style, it's again very misleading, this style was already going out of fashion. And we are not talking about just the main municipal and administrative buildings in these cities, we are talking about entire large quarters. And not only the buildings, but the entire layout of the quarters with the straight geometrical patterns in the planning, which is an absolutely compulsory feature of all these neoclassical cities found all over the world. This is very important because it proves that we are not talking about cleaning up certain areas and replacing it with such buildings as the Western influence gets stronger. And by the way, would you really believe that the traditional Japanese people, which are relatively at least traditional till date, would demolish to the ground the entire central parts of already established cities, parts which hypothetically, following the logic of this scenario, would have contained the best examples of their traditional architecture, and replace it all with the styles of newcomers, which are not very well welcomed there, and a style which, as I said, is anyway going out of fashion. There are quite few star forts in Japan as well. Now, this type of architecture was prevalent actually all over the world, but that was centuries ago when Japan was supposedly absolutely isolated, first of all, according to official sources, because it was very primitive, and second of all, when the Rusuis arrived and announced that Japan is cut off from the world, closed for external connections. If the official history of Japan, which they are selling to us, was true, all these star forts and the neoclassical large quarters should not have existed for sure. Overbuilding has always been a problem in Japan. For example, this is an old photograph which shows the state of affairs in terms of overbuilding more or less at the time when Japan got opened for the Western world. So the centers of the major cities would have been at least this much crowded in terms of buildings. So if there was a demolition of all the central areas, the main areas of these cities, I mean, there should have been something recorded in history about such an unbelievable scale of demolition. No. The truth is that it was these Rusuis who brought this style with them. And their brothers, so to say, brought it all over the world. We saw the same problem in America. Again, same style of buildings, and again the explanation was very, very fishy. And now combine all this with the artificial 1000 years which were added to the mainstream history, which means that many of the empires and exotic kingdoms which we have been conditioned to believe were ancient actually existed hundreds of years ago, then everything falls into place actually. And the full story of the so-called neoclassical style looks much more sensible. It's not that the people all of a sudden felt nostalgia and started building in a style which was forgotten for many, many centuries. So people used to build in this very same way 2000 years ago, and then all of a sudden 200 years ago they adopted the same style without any change. And on the top of that, very importantly, as we're gonna see in the future episodes, they use the same techniques. Now here it gets very suspicious. Very, very suspicious, because the official academics are telling us, oh, 2000 years ago they used something, we're not sure what, we can't really replicate it nowadays. And then we see the absolutely same technique, again unknown to us, in buildings built 200 years ago in St. Petersburg. So this is a photograph of the aftermath of the nuclear devastation in Japan. Not only in the background we see a building, the style of which looks very awkward along the official Scaligerian history of Japan, but also in the foreground, the head doesn't look less awkward. Its features are not particularly Japanese.
Very interestingly, more than 80% of Japanese gods are originally Indian gods.
If you are neither Japanese or Indian, maybe you will not recognize, but this is not Japanese chanting. This is like a real Indian Hindu chant. So in this documentary, there is a rich evidence that what is commonly known as traditional Japanese Buddhism is nothing else but a branch of the Hinduism. Here on this contemporary depiction of Japan, we see the deities of Brahma and Shiva, which we are automatically conditioned to connect only with India, but in reality they are worshipped all over Southeast Asia and apparently in Japan as well. This is the four-headed Lord Brahma, the engineer of our universe. As you can see, a traveler who was making illustrations of Japan saw the same thing as we see on the old Indian statue. This really looks like Shiva and Parvati sitting on his lap. That's how he's depicted till date in India, with Parvati on his lap, and the Rudraksha is a typical attribute of Shiva. The large Rudraksha beads are seen on both Indian and Japanese depictions, and also the moon symbol, again the main symbol of Shiva. It's always in the Indian and in the Japanese depiction. This is nothing else but a Lord God Varaha in Japan, also considered an incarnation of the Supreme Lord in India. Here a Japanese temple with all these multi-headed deities typical for Hinduism, at least from what we were taught in school. So here we see a Japanese bowing down to some foreign-looking statues, and let's see the inscription below it, Kan Roi. Well, Kan by itself is the Mughal name for a ruler. Roy means king, so yeah, this is the king. And what is he bowing down to? Deva. And yes, that is the Hindi word for God. So when they were making up the history of all nations, not only Japan, they always used the same trick. Ignore obvious parallels and make things look as if they developed locally. Everything, religion, culture, governments. Why? First of all, people would look more stupid, yeah? Unable to communicate between continents, between faraway kingdoms, and that's why they are always depicted as developing separately, yeah? To look primitive. Second of all, this feeds the idea that we have always been separated, and now it's easier to trap us into stupid nationalism. In this way, they can easily organize us into suicidal wars. And so we're drawn into inflicting more and more self-organized tragedies upon ourselves. As we sit and watch Hollywood movies daily, subtly into us is implanted every day, little by little, that all these excessive military projects of all kinds and description are being carried out for the purpose of defending us from our neighbors. And yes, sometimes the military will be used for that purpose, but very rarely. Its real purpose is destruction of anything godly and beautiful found amongst the human race as a whole. And back to religion, the official history of Japan doesn't really deny this connection with Hinduism. It just considers it so remote and vague that in reality even the modern Japanese themselves are not aware of it at all. They don't know that in essence they are Hindus themselves. And presenting the religion of Japan in wrong light nowadays is also very important for those who have interest in keeping the human race submerged in ignorance. And when we start tracing the root of what we call Hinduism nowadays, the Hindus themselves call it Sanatana Dharma. When we take a close look at that, one thing leads to another, and again, at the end we find the root at the survivors of Hyperborea, which may also be connected to Atlantis. And here it is how.
So it is not that the people who live in India came up with all this knowledge, Sanatana Dharma, Vedic scriptures, Hinduism, all this is very synonymous. So the people don't even claim that they came up with this. It was given to them by rishis or sages, wise men,
who appeared amongst them specifically with the purpose to come and educate them. So where did these wise men come from? It is described in the Vedic books themselves. They came from the north. Well, there is a lots of stuff north of India, but this Vedic Pandit pinned down their original location in the Arctic region, which, as we know, is the place where Hyperborea used to exist. In modern time, the entire Hyperborea is declared to be a fantasy, together with the Aryan people which were related to it or came from it. But the people who take to heart the teachings of the Sanatana Dharma consider them a real people, and that seems to be the truth after all, because in the Vedas it is described how they mixed with a portion of the locals, and those were later assigned to be Brahmins, priests or rulers, Kshatriyas. And till date in the Indian society, the caste system established by these rishis or sages is functional, and the DNA tests of those who belong to the higher castes clearly show the Caucasian genes that they have, and also the people who belong to the higher castes are of a visibly lighter color. So the Aryans were real and tangible people, not less real than you yourself. Wherever we have the traditional stories of them coming and educating the locals, we also see their genes in the DNA tests, and we also see the Aryan influence in the language. Despite all that, official historians prefer not to notice them, if they want to keep their jobs, of course. And so modern people are given very general definitions of what an Aryan is, general to the point that it becomes meaningless. And further, the very word has been stained by Hitler, who used the term to promote war, violence and crime. And the people bought his lies and followed him to this path to hell because they were already deceived beforehand. They didn't know that the actual original meaning of Aryan means noble. A real Aryan would never initiate a war, would never cause suffering to any soul. Absolute non-violence is the essential quality of the Aryans. This is not my personal interpretation, it's written again and again in the old books, but the people who bought into the lies of Hitler didn't know about those old books. They knew only the modern history lies.
So, in the previous video, we touched on the subject of the origin of the various human races as mixtures of various tribes which lived on Earth and races from other planes or spheres of existence, and in some cases even other dimensions which mated with these tribes. Often it was done purposefully, with the intention to create a new type of people. And very often, they would end up as the rulers of that given tribe and their offspring. The results of such mixtures would usually inherit some of the qualities of the non-human race, and this would be inclined to represent its interest while ruling the given nation or tribe, which, as usual, will have positive and negative effects. Although in the Western world, snakes and all kinds of reptilian creatures are hardly objects of reverence, this is not at all true for the Asian people. In many Asian traditions, they are considered as primeval forefathers and seed givers. Yes, exactly, seed givers for the people. Here in this Chinese city, they even erected a modern monument celebrating this union of the human and reptilian genes. In various regions of Asia, not everybody bows down to creatures of this type, but a lot of them do. Besides bowing down to them, they embrace them and kiss them. This is a real historic statue. Well, it disappeared recently, but that seems to be a pattern. It seems to happen to many important artifacts. That reveals the truth, and it's not an isolated fantasy artifact. There's a lot of this in the old Japanese books.
So in certain areas of Russia, dwarfs like this have been spotted many times. There are a few corpses, also mummies, which are available. This is definitely not some rumor. It is a real thing, witnessed and studied by many. This one was actually alive. They killed him. But the interesting connection with Japan here is that the Japanese officials showed very, very vivid interest in it. I think there were a couple of TV teams shooting a lot of material about this type of creatures. And the reason for this vivid interest was that it turned out that in their traditional books they found information that these are some of their worshipable deities, and even possibly genes from them were used in making their race. I even vaguely remember that in one of the materials I saw a long time ago, there was also an old Japanese material similar to this one, but depicting a creature exactly like the dwarf. And in addition to that, the Japanese team offered quite a solid sum of money. I believe it was at least 1 million, if not a couple of them, for the corpse. They wanted to have it really badly. The offer was declined. And please don't get me wrong, I'm not implying that only the Asian race has some reptilian mixture in it. Similar depictions of such beings mixing with people, that's why very often we see them in some sort of depictions connected with insemination or raising children. There is quite a few of them. This is from Panama, South America, Sumerian, and you can find many others easily on the internet. Egypt, of course, and here it says found in China. I don't have any details, but it really looks like the skeleton of one of the scary fellows we saw in the previous depictions. So there was a lot of mixing going on all over the globe. But yet it is the Asian race exactly where the memories of it are most abundant. No matter at which historic, relatively recent period we take a close look at, we always find some sort of dodgy stories in the official history. So, keeping this in mind, is there even a point to try to guess what was in the really ancient history of Japan? I think it's pointless. We simply lack available sources. For example, in this castle, they found Roman and Ottoman coins. Well, okay, coins are relatively lighter. Maybe it wasn't exactly Romans who brought them here. Although, after you watch the rest of the Survivors episodes, you won't be surprised if the Romans did it indeed. But for the other, much heavier parts, like for example, things that look like spare parts of megaliths, it's much harder to find explanation like for children, and that's why the modern quackademics simply ignore them.
Hello everyone, we're in Japan, and we are in the Nara prefecture of Japan, and right now I'm standing atop what is locally called as the rock ship of Masuda. Moving on to Osaka Castle. Again, giant megalithic blocks, some of them weighing up to 100 tons. So on some of these stones, you see a lot of this like kind of notch work right here. And I noticed this also on the other stones that I showed you previously. And one of the guys told me, a local, said that they were used to break the stone off. So you gotta wonder, maybe these stones were reused for something and they were used for something else previous to building giant walls and things like that.
Yes, it really looks like as if they chopped the older, bigger megaliths whenever they could to make the new ones. And according to the Russian group of LAI, Laboratory for Alternative History, they really made a serious expedition and tried to study the region, but they found lots of sites which from outside gave the impression that they could be very interesting, huge megalithic work, but they were fenced and closed down for public access like forever and without any explanation. So in this video I'm going to show you why the so-called glorious thousands years long history, ancient history of China is nothing else but fiction, bedtime stories. As you read those bedtime stories, you will be left with the impression that they are based on some sort of old chronicles. What kind of chronicles? The oldest chronicles, at least amongst those that we have actual access to, are barely 200 or 300 years old. Also, they want you to believe that the stories are based on some sort of very ancient recorded astronomical observations. So I'm gonna show you what is the so-called proof of that, and these observations are actually very recent, and the oldest horoscope that they have is barely some 300 years old. To fix the problem with the obvious lack of correlation between the historic artifacts and the so-called history, genuine historic sites are in this condition, lettuce garden, while so-called historic artifacts like the Great Wall of China, which is actually still being built, it's very modern, are loudly advertised by the historians and the tourist agencies. And yes, in China there are actual historic ruins of various walls, but isn't it strange that the arrow slits at some of them are in direction China and not in the direction of the imaginary invaders? Now, the Chinese people did have a actual history and records, but when the military force arrived, as usual from Europe, same story as in America, as in Japan in the previous episodes, and it will be repeating itself in Egypt and all the future episodes again and again, their priority was to erase the history. So what they used in China was to drug the local population, literally to the point that they forgot who they are. That's how the traditional history was substituted with the mainstream fairy tales, and that's why historic sites like this with high-tech tool marks are ignored, and maybe that's why they found the modern artifact in a so-called very
All the grottos and caves we've seen so far are included in the official history of China. The historians find some place for them. If needed, they make up their own hypothesis and then present it as fact, but somehow they fit them in somewhere. But when it comes to the Kuashun and Long Q cases, total silence. Mainstream historians strongly prefer that they are not even mentioned at all at any cost. They classify them as mysterious, or more beautiful words like magical grotto of theological nuggets. Well, scientists weren't really versed in magic, right? How can they say this is magical? What does magical mean to them, anyway? The actual reason to avoid any discussion about these caves are the tool marks left by the equipment used in them. Now, compare the high-tech looking marks from China with this quarry from Estonia, which is barely 100 years old. And still, the marks on the wall are very chaotic. And now, compare the historic Chinese tool mark with the latest modern equipment tool mark.
The network of labyrinths is so vast that it stretches over tens of kilometers. Practically an entire mountain is made hollow. There is no trace of the stone that was taken out, which of course should have been the size of a mountain itself. Was it taken off-site, or was it spread around by one of the great floods? It seems the Chinese had a good record of their own history before the fairy tales were forced with military power and drugs upon them by the European colonialists.
There are plenty of references to advanced technology in the traditional Chinese chronicles. They had metal flying dragons that were transporting beings throughout the universe, not just Earth. There were metal servants that they were using to do the hard work, which we would today call robots. And their mass media was much more informative than ours, because they were well aware of the developments of the war between the parasites and the humans. For example, they reported in their chronicles that at one point, some of the non-earthly beings involved in this conflict closed off contact between Earth people and their allies, the godly beings of the universe. It really appears that compared to the Chinese people of the past, we are in an informational blackout these days. According to the chronicles, even the first emperor of China himself was a non-earthly being, and this is supposedly the burial pyramid of his son. Although both the father and the son didn't exist according to modern scholars, they assure us that they got buried. However, they were never born. Wikipedia even says that this is the only pyramid in China, which is extremely strange given the fact that China is the home of hundreds of pyramids, some of them very, very large. They aren't open for research, but they leave the impression that they are made mostly of earth. But there are stone pyramids as well.
Now let's visit an actual ancient historic site in China to see how it matches the history. It looks kind of newish to me for a person who lived 8,000 years ago. It looks as new as the pavement around it, doesn't it? So here is the information about the actual structure. So the emperor lived 8,000 years ago, but only in the imagination of the people. Then they made a tomb for him 1,000 years ago. And as far as the actual thing, it says, when the tomb was renovated 300 years ago, the entire complex had long disappeared. Pardon, this is not renovation, this is building from scratch. So 300 years ago, somebody made something pyramidal here. Probably the stones we see actually are 20 or 30 years old, if not much less. And this is shown to the people as an evidence of the many thousands years long history of China. And also this type of sites are shown to the tourists as being 2,000 years old. How come the wood didn't rot or petrify? This is not in a deserty area. These structures were recovered from the damp soil, and if they were indeed that old, they should have completely rotten by now. And then a Swiss watch found in a 400-year-old Chinese tomb. And then the red herring of time travel. Probably that's what it is. Not that finding out the truth about time travel is less important than finding out the truth of our origin, but when we are sent to the wrong address to look for the wrong thing, we won't find out the truth, neither about time travel nor the dating of the actual tome. Mummies of tall, Caucasian, and often very beautiful people are found also in China. But yet, their role in Chinese history is largely or completely ignored. And the reason for that doesn't seem to be that currently the Asian race resides there, even in places like Australia, New Zealand, Egypt, South America, where actual Caucasian people live even nowadays. Still, such mummies are found and they are always excluded from history. So it seems to be a centrally managed thing. And by the way, in the modern countries where people of this type, tall and white, still live, the project aiming at replacing this type of population with other people are still carried out. Under the flag of fighting racial discrimination, all kinds of rules and laws are enacted, and if you read them carefully and see them in action, you will always notice that they create that discrimination. They start with talk about equality and end up with rules which favor only one certain group.
After observing all these discrepancies between actual artifacts and history in the books, one starts wondering, how did this commonly accepted history of China appear anyway? Well, the first written historic chronicles of China date from the 17th century, when for the last time all old books were gathered by the ruling dynasty.
They were burned down,
And a new history was composed because the old one
didn't comply with the agenda of those in power at the given moment.
There's no need to search for alternative sources. In the chronicles themselves, it is said how they appeared. In the 17th and 18th century, there was a lot of activity going on in terms of establishing or creating the Chinese history. The history of the previous dynasties was unacceptable to the current one, and that is why there was the need to create private histories. That is what they called it. In the year 1772, the government collected every printed book ever issued in China. The process of gathering all the books continued for 20 years. The committee that oversaw the collection of the books consisted of 360 men. All books were separated into 4 categories. After a couple of years, 3,457 of them were printed again in a new form, and the rest of them, mainly 6,766, were only catalogued, but some under different names. And this complete rewriting and issuing of completely new books happened at least 3 or 4 times in the history of China. We don't know exactly how many times, because there were no records from one rewrite to another. And each time there was a language reform, which made it very difficult for the people to understand the older hieroglyphs.
The hieroglyphic writing of China is one consisting of symbols, and as people were forced into language reforms, they not only lost part of their history, which could no longer be recovered from the old chronicles, even if they wished to, but most importantly, they were losing connection with the paradigm of the advanced old civilizations which laid the bedrock of their culture. So what is the aftermath of these language reforms and a writing of private histories? Anybody who has tried to read the chronicles that are available unanimously agrees that this is the most chaotic and unsystematic historical record that they can imagine. So these murky waters of the history of China gave scope to the modern history fabricators to run their imagination wild. And they did so without any pang of conscience whatsoever. And so we read about fairy tale kingdoms that existed thousands of years ago. And what is the dating based on? I would really like you to show you the basis of their dating. The bases are,
Quote,
the well-recorded, sophisticated astrological observations that were running in an uninterrupted line in China for thousands of years. Now please pay very close attention because I'm gonna show you those continuous records of sophisticated observations. Here is the proof in its entirety. I'm really not joking, this is taken from this book, a very respected mainstream history book that is a product of international research. And here is how they explain it to us. These are not some parts of a clay pot vessel, these are astronomical records. And observations of sunspots are recorded on them. And because these pieces of clay pot must be, they say, must be at least 5,000 years old, that shows undoubtedly that the Chinese at that time had sophisticated observatories marking and studying and recording the sunspots activity. And by the way, how did they conclude that these pieces are whatever 5 or 4,000 years old? Well, that's not even mentioned in their so-called research. That is just given as an axiomatic fact of the existence that cannot be doubted for any reason.
But this superb historic comedy doesn't end here. They continue. Well, this isn't the only proof. There are other proofs of their sophisticated observatories of the ancient Chinese. And what is that? A Neolithic hero has been unearthed in Piyang in Hunan, China. On both sides of the buried skeleton, 2 mosaics were found, made of seashells. One of them anger, and the other a dragon.
Somebody expressed the opinion that these shells could be placed there, keeping in view the positions of the stars. And since this Neolithic burial should be some 5,000 years old, from this we can conclude that the astronomical observations of the Chinese have started at least 5,000 years before Christ. And I didn't make it concise. That was the full research, that was the full proof on which they base the dating of the dynasties that they found in the unsystematic chronicles. But I can tell you in short what is the rest of the book about, with one very good example. For example, there is somewhere in this chronicle a mention that the people gathered and watched how the stars are aligned in the sky. And that means that they watched the special alignment apparently that happens every 5,000 or 6,000 years, and it occurred exactly 5,000 years ago, and they watched exactly that. How did they guess it? There is no mention in where were the planets, in what alignment, in what degree. There is nothing. Basically it says the people were watching the sky because there was something happening there. And on the basis of all this so-called scientific research, it has been established that these glorious Chinese kingdoms happened thousands of years ago. While in reality, we have almost no clue what was happening in China before 17th century even, what to speak of thousands of years ago. On one side, the Chinese historic records were corrupted by continuous language reforms and burning of old books. On the other hand, the general population was helped into forgetting the original advanced culture that they had some connection with by rewriting their hard disk with the help of opium. The British could not colonialize China, and that is why they had to find an alternative method to undermine their culture from inside by poisoning them. Not all drugs are poisonous and addictive, but the way opium was used in this case was absolutely negative. And although modern interpretations of the full development with the cunning introduction of opium in China by the British is always presented as some sort of economic operation for profit, please don't forget that it is the smaller players who are after money, those who only fulfill orders. Those who are on the top are not after money because they issue money, they create money. They can create as much money as they want for themselves, and they do it by simply printing more and more and giving them to friends who would do them favors in exchange. So those on the very top were not chasing monetary profit. Their aim was lowering the human consciousness, erasing the human memory, and rewriting the very definition of what human is. Because the original humans were being of goodness, being that naturally live in harmony with nature and the cosmos. Well, that full setup of happiness and harmony did not fit well with the new paradigm that was artificially imposed upon the humans.
Amongst the artifacts of Chinese culture called Hongshan, we find this interesting statue, very much resembling an Egyptian goddess or the samurais we saw in the previous episode, or Lord Shiva from India. He is also depicted with a crescent in his hair, so it looks also very similar to this. And of course the mummies and many other similarities in elements of art and culture of any sort prove that the Chinese were well connected with the world and this worldwide culture. I may call them survivors, others call them gods, deities, or even aliens. But don't be confused by the different names. At the end it boils down to the same thing. Tall beings who came and mixed with the simple local tribes and taught them philosophy, art, crafts and culture. But from those relatively far away times, sadly we don't have any records from China due to the book burning and writing of so-called private histories after that. The earliest relatively reliable records that we have are from the Manchu dynasty.
Now it really seems that these Manchu people were the last wave of survivors. First of all, they were foreigners. Their language is alive till nowadays in some villages.
So we know for sure their language is radically different from Chinese. Just look at the architectural style of the Manchu people and there will be no questions left in terms of their origin. No, this is not a mistake. These are ruins in China, not in Europe.
And by the way, there is linguistic evidence that originally the very name of the dynasty Manchu originated from Mogul. And those are the same Moguls that were the last wave of survivors in India. and currently they are on purpose confused with the Mongols.
The people of nowadays Mongolia were certainly part of this worldwide culture, and certainly its influence was stronger, as we said, in East and Central Asia, where Mongolia is located. But to put an equation mark between the modern Mongolians and the Mongols or Moguls mentioned in the older texts is a mistake. For example, in the Chinese chronicles that we are talking about, this is the description of the Moguls.
Very tall white people with blonde hairs and blue eyes.
And that's how all other contemporary writers describe them. So how do the mainstream historians read these chronicles? Exactly like the devil reads the Bible. Aha, so here it says Mongolians lived in China. Correct, yes. Mongolia is close to China, so there was some mixture, yes. And they don't even tell you that it is not Mongolians but Moguls. And as far as the description of the outer appearance of these Moguls, that's deleted. Just skipped, as if it is not there. The Manchus themselves claimed that they are descendants of a dynasty which ruled over the entire earth. That would be kind of a ridiculous and out of place claim if they were indeed the small insignificant tribe that the mainstream historians are convincing they were, so obscure that nobody even ever recorded anything about them. But such a claim would be completely normal if the Manchus were indeed descendants of the rulers of Tartaria, who seem to have had the last connection with Hyperboreans. And by the way, a lot of the material in this episode is just concise quotes from the works of Anatoly Fomenko. A lot of it is translated in English and published for free on his website. So if you want to find a lot more interesting stuff, you can visit the website.
And by the way, the Manchu dynasty ended up in China, again fleeing from Siberia, or at least some part of them. Some other records suggest that others come from the nowadays Macedonian territories. It was most likely an international gathering of survivors. Part of them went to Japan and founded the samurai dynasties. Yet another division of these warriors settled in China. So what were they fleeing from? Why did they abandon their homeland? It was like this. In the older times, there were no countries in the sense that we have them nowadays. There were just tribes and nations. But as the parasitic influence was increasing, countries started to appear. The parasites began to use the tactic of divide and conquer amongst those countries to have the people kill themselves, rather than having an all-out war against the parasites.
When the survivors also found themselves already in such a situation, they also had to make some sort of a country, and that was Tartaria, which was immediately broken into pieces, and then these pieces were defeated separately. The last standing one, or at least one of the last standing, was in Siberia. And when the last piece of Tartaria was defeated by the newly formed Russia, the general population simply remained to live on the land where it was born, and gradually its memory was washed away by the mass media. But the army, the military force, they didn't wish to settle of such life which seemed like slavery to them, and instead decided to flee to relative safety, China and Japan. There are some remnants of their style of combat. These are the Eastern martial arts. Since all records about Tartaria have been meticulously destroyed, we know very little about these things, although they happened relatively recently. But whatever little is in the works of Anatoly Fomenko, I'm presenting it here. At that time, the king of Tartaria was murdered, and there was only a young prince left. Maybe the army took him to a relative safety to Japan or China.
Another interesting detail from the Chinese chronicles is that these Manchu people were foreigners, and they were of a very small number. They were trying desperately not to mix with the local population, but since they were so few, their assimilation within the local race became inevitable and was just a question of time.
And here comes a very curious note from these Chinese chronicles. It says that after the Manchus got assimilated by the locals, they lost their special abilities, like psychic abilities to fight. I find this very, very important. So maybe the Tartarians still had some special abilities that they learned from the Hyperboreans, or they had a lot of like mixture with the Hyperborean blood flowing in their veins. That's why they had their special abilities. Now, what about all the other numerous Chinese dynasties which, according to the mainstream story, ruled China for many thousands of years? Although nothing can be said for sure, as mentioned previously, the chronicles are very confused and disorderly. But I'm gonna present to you the hypothesis of Anatoly Fomenko, which seems to be the most sensible one, until we have any additional information at least. So when the Manchu people came to China, they wrote down the history of their own dynasty, which happened in different lands, and that was their history, so they wrote down their history. And later on, when all this writing of so-called private histories and confused chronicles started, possibly now actually dynasties which existed at other geographical locations and not China are now viewed as Chinese dynasties. And there are quite few points supporting this hypothesis. For example, there were Huns in this history. Now the Huns, the Hungarian Huns, they are in Europe. Okay, just one name cannot confirm anything, but the neighbors of the Huns were the Serbi. Now, Serbs, these are the Serbian people. In their own language, they call themselves Serbi. So they are the neighbors of the Hun. And then on the north, so the Chinese chronicles also talk about the tribe of Chechi. That's how the Czech people call themselves. Yeah, so what about Czechs in China in mainstream terms? All these tribes, the mainstream history has one solution for all of them. Well, they existed in the past and now they have disappeared. Did they disappear, all of them? Or maybe they are well and living in Europe. The north of where the dynasties were ruling, I mean, were the Sveni or Shveni, and this is how the Nordic people of Sweden call themselves. And they certainly are located in the north, but it would make more sense if you're, let's say, in Europe and you say they're in the north. If the chronicles were written for China as we know it today, that would be east. So these are just some resemblances in terms of the names of the tribes. Now there are there is a lot common in the events which happen in this Chinese history, too many parallels with the European history. It is very interesting. Again, if you wish, you can find it for free online in the works of Anatoly Fomenko, probably also in English.
But it's not good to study history only from books. Let's go there, on the spot. At last I would like to present you an interesting blog that I found of a real person who decided to visit the town of Guanyi in China because the biggest burial complex is located there, and it supposedly belonged to an emperor called Zhen Zuan. These are a few old photos of this location. Well, it all looked very different nowadays. In the beginning it was kind of okay, like these photos. But when he started walking around, he discovered that the Chinese can have a very practical attitude towards history. Even the very shrine of the emperor, or maybe this belongs to the queen or some nobility, something like that, but it is a supposedly ancient shrine, even that can have very practical applications. Also, his very journey to the town of Gian is very informative as of the current culture in China. To reach the town, he took a local bus for a journey some 40 kilometers long, and he was hoping he'll be there in an hour or so. However, it took him a full day. How is that possible? Well, due to the innovative marketing strategies of the person who is responsible for selling the tickets on the bus. So this lady made the bus stop at every corner, and she would get down and try to convince the bypassers that they have to go to Gian today. Well, people were trying to refuse because obviously they must have had some other agenda in their mind. That's why they went on the street going somewhere else. But she would not take no for an answer. She would actually try to drag them to the bus. Well, the innocent women were screaming, but some of the stronger men even tried to defend themselves.
To me, it really looks like something cast out of beton. And probably that's what it is exactly, as we are gonna see in the next episode, I believe.
Well, this is China today.
Hopefully the modern Chinese people will do something about it, otherwise all the glorious kingdoms which lasted 8,000 years may suffocate under a couple of meters of plastic bags. There are roughly 3 to 4 times more pyramids in China, at least visible ones, than in Egypt. And in addition, they are in a much better condition of preservation than the Egyptian ones. And yet, not many are aware of this. What to speak of finding out more details about them? And that's next to impossible. Even on the spot, people have tried over there in China. And usually, if you try, for example, to take photographs from nearby, very quickly some Chinese will emerge from somewhere and make it clear that you can't do that. Actually, the Chinese even admitted that they have pyramids when people started flying on airplanes, and too many photographs of them emerged. Before that, China denied having any pyramids. We don't have any pyramids. And the situation with the geoglyphs is even more interesting. I don't know if they are more in terms of quantity than the Nazca geoglyphs, but they are certainly more informative, so to say, because many of them appear to be functional, if I can say so, and they are connected, plugged in to modern installations of some sort. And so is one of their pyramids, at least one. So there was somebody who made very interesting documentaries about this, and yeah, recently his channel doesn't exist anymore. His website also is doesn't exist, and blogs, everything has simply vanished. So I will leave a link in the description to some remains of his work. I'm trying only to touch topics which may allow my channel to exist longer. Lately, the measures taken against people who speak the truth are getting tighter and tighter. People who are telling the truth about what's going on the world political scene have their websites blocked. When people type in the web address, a message pops up for your own security. Do not continue. There is malware, there is phishing attempts, spamming, and all these types of things. Well, the reality is that the given website has only the truth, no malware, no spam. So everything seems to be allowed in the universe and everybody has freedom. So the people, most of the people, don't mind, don't know, and don't care that the truth is suppressed in such way. And this situation is very advantageous for certain parties who surely won't hesitate to explore it further. And I guarantee you that very rapidly we'll be descending into informational darkness abyss. Whatever you hear, whatever you see, everything will be a lie. You won't be able to trust your own eyes even. Because in one of my recent videos we saw how certain filters can be put in front of the image of the sun. It can get dark, it can blink when it gets dark. When it gets black, it doesn't get dark on Earth. So all this could be similar to some sort of circus magic. So who knows, maybe the skies will be turned into a gigantic monitor where all kinds of deceived holograms will be shown to us. But our own will and desire is the most important thing. And those who have made a different choice, who in their heart have decided that they have zero tolerance for any type of lies and deceit, these are the people who will always refuse to take part in violence and crimes, no matter what kind of reasons and explanations they will be offered in order to be enticed into such things. They will have the power to see through all the lies, even though everybody else around will believe the deceit which will pour from all newspapers, radio, and TV stations. And these are not predictions based on the Bible, these are predictions made on the basis of what has been happening to people who speak the truth within the last couple of weeks.
Wait a minute.